Hi, good evening, everyone, and it gives me great privilege to be the facilitator today for this esteemed group of panelists. And I'd like to thank all of you for sacrificing some of your time this evening and attending this webinar on suicide. It's a really important topic, and I think one that we can never have enough conversations about. Yet it's quite a somber topic and not one that I think people tend to look forward to speaking about. But nevertheless, it's something that I think plagues not just South African society, but the world at large. And it's something that doesn't seem to be going away, and we don't seem to be really moving the needle on as a problem in society. And that is the issue of suicide, both in terms of how to reduce suicide rates in the country, but also how to help and support those who are suffering with suicidal thoughts, and also how to help family members and friends and people who are affected by the loss of loved ones who do go on to die by suicide. So welcome everybody. My name is Suntosh Pillay, and I've been invited by PsySSA, the Psychological Society of South Africa, to facilitate the panel today. I'm a clinical psychologist by profession, and I'm based in Durban, in King Dinuzulu Hospital Complex, which is a public hospital in Durban, and I've been working here for just over 10 years now. And I've also been involved in a number of advocacy initiatives in mental health around the province, and some of them nationally as well. So suicide is something that's quite close to my heart, in the sense that it is an issue that I deal with on a daily basis in terms of the patients that I see and the people that I assist, assessment and psychotherapy. But also it's something that is at the heart of a lot of mental health advocacy that me and my colleagues and community activists are involved in. So I hope this evening, not only to facilitate an important conversation, to ask some difficult and perhaps even controversial questions of my panelists, but also to learn from all of you who are attending today, because we've given a significant amount of time in the program to hear the voices, the questions, the opinions, and the contributions of all of the attendees as well. So please do stick around right until the end, because we really hope to turn this into a conversation that can include not just the panelists who have joined us tonight, but also all of you who've made the time to be on what I would call an ordinary Wednesday evening. And I say that quite deliberately, because I'm glad that this conversation is happening on a random day in March, and not only in July, which is often Mental Illness Awareness Month, not just in September, which commemorates World Suicide Prevention Day, not just on October 10th, which is World Mental Health Day, that on an ordinary day, we are able to gather at 6:15 in the evening and actually have a conversation about a topic that many people rather shy away from or run away from. So thank you, one and all, for attending this evening. I would like to just briefly allow some of the panelists to introduce themselves rather than me reading out their biographies, and their biographies are available in full on the PsySSA website. First up, I would like us to hear from Cassie Chambers, who is the Operations Director at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. So Cassie, if you don't mind just turning on your mic and camera and just saying a little bit about yourself, and perhaps a few sentences about what drives your passion in this area.
Thank you very much, Suntosh, and good evening to everyone. And a special thank you to PsySSA for including myself and SADAG in this really important conversation. As you mentioned, Suntosh, we can't talk about this topic enough, clearly. My name is Cassie Chambers. I'm the Operations Director at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. I first started over now 16 years ago as a volunteer counselor who used to work on a Friday night, 4 to 8 shift, when we were a lot quieter, and taking calls from people around the country who needed someone to talk to. And over the years and through training and exposure and experience, working up through the call center and advocacy and community work and school talks, now being part of SADAG and seeing all the important work that it does on the ground SADAG, the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, has been around for over 27 years, and we run the country's only suicide crisis helpline. So we're incredibly passionate about the topic. We assist and provide crisis intervention. I think one of the important things that I get to do on a daily basis is work with an amazing team. We have amazing volunteers who give up their time every week to answer calls and help people. And I think for me, the biggest motivator why we're so passionate about this topic and helping people is, I think it's the voices and the people that we get to speak to every day who phone us feeling incredibly helpless and hopeless. You can hear it in their voice. And then after talking to them and providing practical resources and really coming up with an action plan, you can hear their voices change and they're filled with hope. And I think that's what brings me back every day, brings the team and our volunteers. And that's why I'm really so privileged to be part of the forum tonight, where we get to talk about this topic, and I think more importantly, a way forward as well. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Cassie. You know, Cassie is no stranger to the public limelight, and I'm sure probably more than perhaps anyone else on the panel, you hear Cassie's voice very often on the radio and in all sorts of media. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of working closely with Cassie over the last couple of years on some joint projects as well. So, you know, if anyone really knows what's kind of going on nationally, as their ear to the ground, quite literally sometimes because of the helpline, it's definitely Cassie Chambers. Next up, we have Glynis Horning, and Glynis is an award-winning journalist who has written quite extensively in the area of mental health and has won awards for her work in mental health journalism. But also people might know Glynis as someone who has written a book called Waterboy, in which she speaks about how she's had to come to terms with her own son's suicide. So Glynis, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for offering not only a perspective as a writer, but also that of a mother who's had to come to terms with what many would think of as an unbearable loss. Can you just say a few words about who you are and what perspective you'll be speaking from this evening?
Suntosh, can you hear me? I will just be
loud
speaking,
and clear.
Good. I'll just be speaking from the point of view of not so much a mental health journalist, but I think tonight as a mother, to give the personal perspective, because I think that's what even the psychologists and psychiatrists that I've worked with and who I've actually consulted, who my son spoke to and who I went to dealing with my grief after my son committed suicide 2.5 years ago, died by suicide. Even they said to me, you know, there's a point that they can help, but then they need to actually put you in touch with support groups and other people who've been there, because it's the voice of people who have actually been there that many professionals maybe don't necessarily hear. So yeah, maybe I'll just speak mostly as a mother, but as a journalist, whatever people might want to ask in questions, it's absolutely fine.
Great. Thanks so much, Glynis. I really look forward to hearing your insights as well. Up next, we've got Dr. Sebo Siepe, and I suppose Dr. Siepe needs no introduction, being the first Black female psychiatrist in South Africa who has a wealth of experience, 3 decades in mental health, and is currently the president of SASOP, which is the South African Society of Psychiatrists. Dr. Siepe, we are so privileged to have you here tonight, and it's really great that I get to kind of meet you for the first time, even though it's virtually as well. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you.
Thank you very much, Suntosh, and thank you very much for the organizers of this roundtable. As you have mentioned, I am Sebo Siepe. I'm a psychiatrist. I am presently working in private practice. And as you mentioned, I'm also the president of SASOP. So I am quite involved in both private and state service. One of my passions has always been educating the public on mental health issues. I've done some work with SADAG a couple of years ago. And of course, any other campaign that is available, and we're on the radio, on print media, any way of communicating. I've been invited by churches, which I found actually very, very important, considering how many members of the public have got sort of some religious affiliations. And I know that it's a contained environment, and one where I always hope that whatever I'm saying actually sinks in and they can pass it on to the others, because I mean, that is how churches work, it's passing instruction to the next person. Yes, and today's topic is one that unfortunately, as a clinician as well, an everyday clinician, that we're coming across every single day, and it is difficult, it's heartbreaking, and it's also sad how often it is happening, and still how much or how unaware people are of what it is, and how it is linked to mental illness. And again, that obviously abuts on people's understanding of mental illness, which is right now in our country quite a problem. But it's not a South African problem, really. I shouldn't say in our country. It is a worldwide problem where mental health has not actually been understood. It's not being, people don't quite know what's happening, and in most cases, it is either ignored or stigmatized, or it's got very negative attitudes which don't make it easy for the sufferer or their family to come forward or to seek help. And of course, we know that again, the issue of actually accessing help is still quite a bit of a problem in many parts of the world, including ours. Thank you, Suntosh.
Thank you so much, Sebo, for those insights. I look forward to hearing more about that also as this conversation evolves. Our next panelist, unfortunately, seems to be running late, but when Saya Pierce-Jones does join us, I might gently interrupt the conversation wherever we are and introduce Saya and allow her to introduce herself as well. But until such time, I think let's get the conversation going. And Cassie, I'd like to start with you, because SADAG runs, to my knowledge, probably the longest and most well-known suicide crisis helpline. It's completely free. It's 24 hours, 7 days a week. And despite the amount of advertising and press and publicity this helpline gets, and despite the number of calls that you guys get overwhelmed with, I suppose it goes without saying that it can never be enough. Because if we just hear about even one suicide in the media, and I think most recently someone like Ricky Rick comes to mind, we wonder, are people using the helpline in the ways that it was envisaged that they would? And what are some of the kind of emerging trends or insights that you are seeing? Because quite literally, you are getting people who are suicidal calling you. And I'm sure that really lends itself to very, very unique insights about what's kind of going on in the mental health of the nation. So please give us some insights from the SADAG Suicide Crisis Helpline, and what are the kind of lessons that we can learn from that?
Thanks so much, Suntosh. And I think this is such an information sharing as well. So I'm very happy to share, and hopefully also some of the thought leaders out there can also, help and engage on this as well. SADAG, when we first started, actually started with our founder, Zane Wilson, who herself had panic and anxiety and realized that there wasn't support for mental health and no one knew where to go, and it was really in crisis. And she started off as one support group that developed into one helpline. And now, 27, 28 years later, we have over 26 helplines that provide free telephone counseling. And I think what's really important is that emphasis of free and making it incredibly accessible. So our numbers are toll-free. They're 0800 numbers, so it's free from a landline or a mobile. So anyone, anywhere can access these services. And people do. We're seeing a huge increase in the number of calls every single day. When we're looking kind of just comparing before COVID, we were getting on average about 600 calls per day to the SADAG helpline, which is a lot of people when you're providing telephone counseling and referrals and helping people get admitted into hospital, or trying to come up with action plans that are really practical, because no two calls are the same. Every situation, every person has different problems that they're going through, different challenges. Since COVID in the last 2 years, the need for this helpline has really grown And the demand for our services has grown even way beyond our expectations. And I think it's something that we manage every single day. We saw our call volumes double overnight to 1,200 calls from that first day of lockdown. So it is incredibly important for us as a call center, as an NGO that relies on amazing volunteers to give of their time. We had to move all of our services and operations remotely. And thank goodness we did, because I think no one anticipated the huge volume of calls that we would get and still get. Now, 2 years later, and with all the compounding issues that COVID has brought, never mind that there's still mental health issues, we have challenges in accessing help, we're getting on average around 2,500 to 3,000 calls every single day. And this excludes emails, social media, SMSs. So many people are reaching out for help, which I think is really positive. So if we look at the intention for the suicide crisis helpline and for the services that SADAG provides, yes, we're seeing more people reach out, and that's great. What we're also then dealing with is that there's this huge demand, which we don't anticipate for. And I think that's where we come in and really trying to think outside the box and creatively trying to help people. Often we can contain a call and we can help someone who is literally standing on a bridge or standing with a gun or about to kill themselves or has serious plans to kill themselves. And what we're seeing is that those kinds of cases are becoming more desperate and more people are feeling really helpless and reaching out. It's great that they have somewhere to go. And there are also other organizations that can provide some mental health counseling. But with regards to suicide, we will provide crisis intervention. We're calling hospitals and finding out, do you have a bed? We're calling, security or police or people to come in and really help with those scenarios. And I think that's where we often hit our biggest challenge, is the referrals and the resources that we need to get people the help. So whether it be waiting for patients to get hospitalized or trying to find a hospital in their area, in their district, that's been some of our key challenges recently. What we do also see on the helpline is that we're seeing people from every age group, every gender, every race, every background, who are really struggling and reach out. And I think that's also, again, very encouraging for us when people can contact us and they do pick up the phone. I think what often keeps us, again, motivated is when we hear someone that calls and says, oh, I wish my husband knew about your helpline a year ago. He might have not have killed himself. Or I wish I knew about your services, 3 years ago when I first started struggling. I would have not been through so much by myself. I think there's still so many people on the ground that don't know about our services, who don't know how to access mental health services in their community. And I think that's why we keep trying to create awareness. When we see an article in the press and media of a 12-year-old boy, which happened this week, who killed himself, or we hear stories of a family who's had to bury a loved one, those are the heartbreaking stories that we keep thinking, what if we could have got them help? What if we could have done something? And I think that's what also keeps us going back, is really trying to help those people. When we look at the nature of the calls, 1 in 5 calls to the SADAG helplines are suicide related, which is a very high ratio. And we know from research and stats from the WHO, we know that South Africa has a very high suicide rate. We know that men in South Africa are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women. And I think when we see that translated in the helplines is we see when we're dealing with a male caller, their suicide risk is often a lot higher. They're more serious. They have more means of killing themselves, as well as when we're dealing with teenagers. Then those are more serious intervention calls that we need to get help. It takes a team of our counsellors and our management team in helping these types of cases, because we don't necessarily have the resources on the ground. It's not like Grey's Anatomy or 911 where we have lots of ambulance and the hospitals are all great. We're really having to troubleshoot each and every case. And I think one of the things that we're also now thinking strategically, looking at 2 years into COVID, seeing how COVID has impacted mental health, and how we're still seeing the calls increasing every month. We're seeing the suicidality increasing every single month. We have to think quite forward and really come up with a strategy and a plan of what do we do in 12 months' time, in 3 years' time? How do we improve this so that when we're expecting or anticipating more calls, that we have more resources? So we do different things just internally, from training new volunteers to constantly learning different ways, crisis intervention. We link with organizations from around the world, really trying to keep abreast in suicide prevention. Because when you're speaking to someone or a family who's been devastated, you don't wish that grief or that pain or even just the feelings of suicide upon your worst enemy. And I think what really helps us at the core of everything that we do, from advocacy to school talks to awareness to press and media, it's the people. You know, from all these stats, from all these stories, from all these number of calls, these are people. These are our people. These are our loved ones. And I think when so many of us have now been touched by suicide or know of someone who's lost someone to suicide, those are the kinds of insights that we as a team take with us in everything that we do, and really try actively, like you mentioned, every day is Suicide Prevention Day, because there's definitely that need. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cassie. I mean, I've got so many follow-up questions I'd like to ask you, but I think that last point you made was so important, which is, you know, you can talk about 600 calls a day, but it's actually 600 people, you know, and humanizing the statistics are so important, you know, because, you know, we can read about the rates and we can read about the numbers, you know, but these are actual people, and behind each person is then a whole family and a whole system, a neighborhood, a community, a workspace, you know, and the kind of ripple effect, you know, of just one person not being able to get the help that they need can actually devastate an entire system and send quite an emotional shockwave, you know, just to put it one way. And Glynis, maybe I can bring you in over here, because I think you probably know this better than any of us on this panel today, because you lost your son Spencer by suicide, and he was 25 when that happened. And how is it that you were able to make sense of that experience? And I know that you write about it at length in your book called Waterboy. And I hope that if any of our attendees have actually read the book and engaged with it, that they might have some questions for you. But I think that's a question that probably is a difficult one to answer completely, but I'm sure it's one that you've been asked many, many times, especially since writing your book. But I would love to hear your perspectives, you know, as someone who now is living with that loss. And just before you answer that question, I want to just acknowledge that Saya Pierce-Jones has joined us. Thank you, Saya. It's really good to see you. And we're just kind of in our conversation at the moment, and Cassie's given us some insights from SADAG's helpline, and we're going to hear from Glynis in a few seconds about her experience of losing her son. And then I'll probably move on to you just after that. So you can just catch your breath, settle in, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, and thanks for my late joining. We had a bit of technical issues on my side, but thank you so much.
Better late than never. Thanks, Saya. Glynis, would you like to share some of your experiences with us?
Yeah, Suntosh. I'm a journalist of many years standing, and a lot of the journalism has been focused specifically on mental health issues. And I thought I understood, written the usual story, quoting SADAG and many other sources on signs to watch out for and all the rest of it. But nothing kind of prepared me for it, the way it erupted suddenly in my life and turned everything upside down. I mean, my son Spencer had been soaring all his life. He was the golden boy. He did exceptionally well at school. He was a swimmer. He was a hiker. He had friends. He was outgoing. And then in his final year of studies in mechanical engineering at university, where he'd done very, very well, suddenly one morning I walked in and I found him curled up, my 6 foot tall, beautiful boy, in a fetal position, sobbing. And it got me out of the left field. I had not expected this because, you know, Cassie and you guys, you professionals, will know the signs that we are told to watch for, which is withdrawal, changes in appetite, changes in your sleeping patterns, hopelessness, irritability, risky behavior, etc., etc. And my boy didn't tick those boxes. And I just did not expect that. And so we then got him into the best help that we could. We had him with a psychologist, a psychiatrist. He was on various medications. And there was a third leg, not just anxiety, he had generalized anxiety disorder, not just major depression, but he had a genetic blood condition called thalassemia minor, which is a minor condition. Most people live with it fine, but it affects the shape and size of your red blood cells, so you have a bit less oxygen, so you have problems with fatigue and concentration. So he was battling those 3 things. And I think those are what joined together to form a bit of a perfect storm. He was caught in the final stages of his university. And so when he went to these specialists, he was put on the medication, he had the counseling, did all the right things, and he went back to his studies part-time while he was teaching master maths along the line. And he seemed to be doing really well, because it was like 3 and a bit years later, he then got his degree, graduated. He felt well enough to the degree that he came off his medications, but under supervision. He consulted his psychiatrist, said he wanted to try and come off them because although the medications, he tried many cocktails and formats of them, although they had helped him, he wasn't quite himself on them. He was Spencer, but not quite Spencer. And then he would have anxiety, so he'd have something which took the edge off that. And then he would be too relaxed, so he needs something to enable him to get back into his studies. And he seemed to really battle with those meds. So he opted to come off them, and he did it carefully, as carefully prescribed by the psychiatrist. He weaned himself off, and he went out and he went for job interviews, and he was about on the Monday morning to start his very first full-time job at an engineering company on the Monday. And that Sunday morning, I was lying in bed reading the papers with my husband, and he went down to feed the dogs in my little home office where I'm sitting now speaking to you. And the next thing I know, he was standing in the doorway with a strange, strangled voice, and he just said, "Spencer is dead." You know, I cannot describe that moment to anybody. Your blood runs cold, your whole world sort of explodes, but you go into denial. So I roared down the stairs, rushed down the stairs to my boy's flat. He had a little flat downstairs next to my home office. And there he was, propped up in his pillows, very, very clearly dead. And so then it becomes a frantic trying to call for help. And I was misdialing, and his younger brother, our second son, was there helping. And the next thing you know, the police have arrived, and the mortuary van turns into your driveway and backs up. And the next thing, they're bagging your boy. You're bagging your beautiful boy and weeding him out and popping him in the back, and they drive off and he's gone. And then you're left with this totally shattered life, and you question everything, absolutely everything, but specifically yourself. You ask yourself, what did I miss? I mean, as a mental health journalist, particularly, how did I not see this coming? What went wrong? How did it happen? And the churning starts. And in my reaction as a journalist, I suppose it's the way one deals with grief, was to busy myself immediately, probing every way I could, reading up more and more on mental health, watching movies, documentaries, reading William Styron's Darkness Visible, all the usual things. And you try to find out what that was that actually got him to where he was and how we hadn't seen it coming. And it is a very, very difficult journey. And I think what helped me, I went for grief counseling as well to the psychologist who had treated our boy, and she was fantastic. But I went through about 6 sessions with her. But more helpful than anything in a way, was actually communicating with what I called my trilogy, my 3 very best friends from early school days. And I think that was my support group. They were to me what SADAG is to the public. And everybody needs a SADAG, or they need a wonderful friend. My 3 friends, one was in the States, a very sharp English lecturer who'd become a real estate agent to support her kids after a divorce, very sharp-tongued and bright. One, a retired UNICEF worker with a heart of gold in Copenhagen, and the other, a woman who'd done counseling and who'd lost her own husband to suicide, wonderful woman who lives in the Cape. And by pouring out my feelings at any hour of the day or night, and my fears, and how did this happen, and what did I do, and could I have done anything on this day, to these women, and having them feed back to me, and just feeling heard and feeling loved, that's what got me through. And that's, in fact, what became the backbone for my book, Water Boy. You talked about trying to put the human face on things, you know, that SADAG, it's not just the statistics, it's not just the numbers, it's the human face. And that's what I've tried to do in this book, to take people in, to give them a glimpse of what one goes through and an insight. And I must say, the feedback I've had from this book has been quite extraordinary. People saying to me, I try to explain to friends who say to me, get over it, you know, pass on from this grief, you know, it's been 6 months, a year, whatever. And I say to them, no, read this book. Or people who have attempted suicides themselves. I mean, I had an amazing call from a man who's in his 40s, and he said when he was Spencer's age, he tried to hang himself, and when he obviously didn't succeed, terrible term, succeed, and he'd been depressed ever since, and he'd been very tempted to try again. But he said, when I read your book, it suddenly showed me that I can't do this to my mother and to my family. So, you know, I say on my book, if I can book cover, if I can say maybe one person would be influenced in some way, it will be worthwhile. And that sort of thing has made it worthwhile. So yeah, it's very difficult. I just know that in terms of what I put out there is that the idea that there are these pat signs to watch for with suicide, people need to know they're not necessarily there. So I don't know what else one can recommend. I mean, we were always there for our boy. We were always loving parents. He knew he was loved. He said so in the note that he left. And you know, he thanked us for all the wonderful memories, but he said, I can't go back on those meds. I can feel myself going into another deep trough, and I can't go back on those meds. And so I'd like to maybe ask whether a psychiatrist maybe, or somebody who prescribes meds on PsySSA to maybe comment a little bit on where one is going in terms of meds. I know that Robert Sapolsky, in a wonderful documentary on why zebras don't get ulcers, he talks about the fact that, you know, there are so many SSRIs out there and many medications, and they're all, it's such a complex area, and to find the right ones for the right people, and to keep them on them or to adjust the doses is what he calls a craps game, a gamble. But he does say for all that and for all the side effects and things, there's nothing more dangerous than an unmedicated depression. And in a way, I kind of wished we'd been warned about that when the psychiatrist agreed to wean our boy off. But then again, I can't blame her. She was convinced he was on the mend, and we were too. It's a very complex area, so hopefully we'll get some insight on that later. Thank you, Suntosh.
Thank you, Glynis, so much. And I look forward to reading the book. And I think I have a copy, but it's, you know, one of those books that just kind of stays on your bookshelf. And I think listening to you speak today for the first time, I think just, like I said, humanizes the statistics, but I think also, judging from the comments in the chat, it's so refreshing to hear, in a way, this kind of raw vulnerability that you have so bravely put forward by allowing us into your lives and by sharing your story in that way. And there are so many people that I think would never have the courage that you have. to actually share your story on a public platform like this. And even while we were organizing this webinar, when I was chatting to one of the organizers, one of the cautions that we had was, if we have someone like yourself on a webinar like this, where is the balance between voyeurism and actually having someone with lived experience just share their story? And we never wanted this to be a voyeuristic escapade into someone else's pain. And I hope that we're able to get that balance right today. As people might ask questions that are probing and personal, but at the same time, as you also have volunteered to share some of your story with us. I'd like to actually go straight to Sebo at this point, because I think your question is almost directed at psychiatry. President of the South African Society of Psychiatrists, I think is best placed in this country, perhaps, and given her 30 years of experience in mental health, to actually speak about some of the aspects around medication. Because I know, Glynis, when you and I chatted on email even before this webinar, you mentioned how the medication was one of the kind of paradoxes you guys had to grapple with. Because on the one hand, the medication left your boy, you said, feeling duller and a slightly plumper version of himself, and he wanted to wean himself off. But at the same time, he couldn't live without them. Dr. Siepe, I mean, how do you as a psychiatrist find that balance between the changes that the medication does to someone, but at the same time, the necessity of medication, especially for depression, given that depression is often a precursor towards people who would think about and intend on acting on those suicidal thoughts?
Thank you very much, Suntosh, and thank you very much, Glynis, for sharing your story with us. Very painful. And again, yes, thank you for, I think, bringing that human side. We are usually on the, I'm not saying we're not the human side, but the experience side. You're on the experience side of somebody who's gone through this. Suicide is a major global mental health and health problem. And I think globally, we're looking at about 1.4% of people in the world who commit suicide, which is really unfortunate. And we also do know from research that 90% of people who commit suicide have got a mental health illness. And of that 90%, 50% is due to depression. Depression is the leader as the one single mental health condition in terms of chances, the very high chance of suicide attempt and unfortunate success. Also in that same range is people with substance abuse disorders, also in the same range is maybe, not to the same extent as depression, I must say, but also people with psychotic disorders. To a lesser extent is people with anxiety disorders or trauma-related disorders to a lesser extent, but still they have a much higher risk of suicide than other people. Suntosh, you asked me about medication specifically. Glynis got it right that yes, medication is not everything, and we don't always succeed in restoring somebody to their very same old person. But as Glynis said, unfortunately, it is a necessary evil, if I have to put it that way. Yes, there are numerous side effects, and it's a balancing act that can we strike the best possible outcome with different type of medications. The cleanest medication obviously would be one drug. It's not always attainable, or it's not easy, and usually we use combinations. But we also know that there are more and more drugs being developed that look at different areas, and you don't want to have one medication for all the different areas. You don't want to do that because you'll have a cup full of medications. But you're hoping to have the best outcome of a certain combination that works best. And yes, and as we are aware, that has happened in Glynis's son. Sometimes people do better on medication with certain side effects that they either can live without or cope with, or they can cope with or without. But again, there is nothing that says people will not get, allow me to use a simple word like tired. And this is not just for depression. I think this goes for many, many chronic illnesses. People get tired and they say it's enough. And that usually goes beyond anybody's judgment. And I think once somebody has made that decision, it is very difficult because they are genuinely tired. And, I think all of us have had even a minor infection where you have to take medication for 7 days. And I think averagely, I haven't seen what the research says, but I think averagely nobody goes beyond day 4 or 5, you know, they don't get to 7, never mind to 14. Now, what about something that says for maybe the rest of your life? It makes it very, very difficult. And there is a different type of thinking that has to be, or a different mindset or something different in your head that will help you to continue doing that. Again, something that Glynis talked about in terms of signs, risks, which I think Glynis's words were, there's no such. With much respect, Glynis, please allow me to say there is such, but it might not be as obvious as we think. I think many a times the expression of mental illness symptoms, the symptoms, how people express their symptoms, it's very difficult, especially in things like depression, anxiety, where there's no psychosis. You have to listen ever so, you know, to the finest little detail, what people are saying, because not everybody's going to say, I am depressed and I am suicidal, but they might use the language that just changes it a little bit. So, you know, or alternatively, they don't say it as distress. And many a times, people who have gone on to take their lives have been noted to be maybe the bubbliest person in the office. You know, he knew everybody, he greeted everybody. But I think all of us as the everybody, we missed something that was going on, that he was saying, or that he wasn't saying, which is also very important. It's what they don't say that we should be listening out for. You know, it's not only what they say. So it's, yes, there's a lot of things that I would, as a clinician, would say, these are the things we want you know, everybody to look out for at all times, both the patient and the family and friends and community and friends. But sometimes it's not what they say, it's what they don't say. And their use of language is not so one-to-one, right? They won't necessarily say, obviously they won't say the things you want to hear, but we have to listen to with a different ear. And we always have to, I have, you know, made up, you know, I have decided that I'm going to always have a very high index of suspicion. That is where I work from, that this is a possibility. And if there is one little bit of distress, it could actually be that doorway to a whole lot of the distress that the person is not showing. So like, Glynis, please allow me with respect, if I may use your son, they're saying that, you know, they've been doing this, they've had enough of it, you know. I want to get off medication, despite the fact that he knew, and I think other people knew that it was a necessary thing. It was an indication of distress, and that is one thing. There's always distress. There's always that feeling of hopelessness and being out of control. And as human beings, we like to be contained. We want to have control. We want to know that I can have a sandwich if I want to, or I can't, you know. But once in others where there is absolutely no control, because if you do not take this tablet, things will go wrong, it is very stressful. And that is where the hopelessness sets in. And hopelessness is a very, very important sign in terms of the depth and severity of the depression, and a high indicator for potential of suicide. So yes, the signs, I believe, one has to look out for them. You know, if we ignore them completely, I think we'd be in more trouble than we are in already. Yes, we're already in very, very big trouble. But I think let us not, I would be very cautious to say, let's throw all that to the wind. And I mean, there are lots of signs that we have to look out for as a patient, as a family member. And sometimes the signs are not what we have described, you know, like again, in this particular case, one thing I have noted as I carry on in this field of work, that a small area or a small issue that people do not necessarily pick on is that loss of control and that loss of autonomy, if we could call it that. Because our lives are such that we are now so, we are in control of most things. We can achieve most things. We can get most things. If I can't get it from myself, somebody else can make me get it, So we are into that where we are conditioned by ourselves or our society or how we live and where we live and things like that, that we are able to attain, we are able to achieve. And we are able to, things should run the way we want because we can do it that way, I can't buy the most expensive car because I can't work that hard and get it, and I'll get a loan from the bank to buy it, everything is within reach. And now suddenly we are faced with these serious psychiatric mental illnesses where we are not actually in control anymore. It now depends on something and somebody. There's something called tablets and some other people. And that is actually very difficult because we are not socialized as we live and grow. Glynis's son had a beautiful family, was a high achiever, everything was there, but there was this area that was very important that he was completely out of control with, which is the depression, which is anxiety. And it's difficult to deal with, to say, but I should be able to get this, I should be able to do this, I should be able to be fine, and it's another human character, which is not always useful, which is why do I have it when so-and-so doesn't? So I will just be like Suntosh and not have this condition. And that is very difficult to settle in our heads. And even with, very good therapists, it's still very difficult to say, yes, I understand, yes, and this is my life and it's going on and it's beautiful, blah, 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 blah. But I have depression and Suntosh doesn't. And I rely on tablets and he doesn't. Why? And that is, it's questions that we cannot answer and that remain very sore point for people, a very difficult point for the sufferers. And rightly so. We cannot blame them for it because it is uncomfortable, it is unpleasant to always have to have your tablets with you. And if you happen to, you're going on holiday, that's what you have to pack in your bag, and you must pack the right number because you must come back on the 5th day as planned. You can't stay longer because now you need medication again. It makes life very difficult. And I think the lay public usually are able to ignore that and make light of it, to say, no, your medication, you're good, you've been seen, what's your problem now, And it's actually far more painful than that. I don't know if we should talk about the risk factors or we should leave it out and let other people talk about other things. Suntosh?
Yeah, thanks, Sebo. I think rather than listing the actual risk factors, I think that's in my mind, which perhaps you can respond to, is how do you strike the balance between knowing from a theoretical and statistical point of view that there are risk factors and the research and the clinical evidence shows that, versus the phrase that hindsight is 20/20, exactly. And in hindsight, I'm sure probably anyone that's lost someone to suicide would be able to now identify those risk factors with much more ease. But when you're in the moment, don't seem as obvious. And I like the phrase that you mentioned, listening with a different ear, but as clinicians, and I empathize with you, as a clinical psychologist, we have that high index of suspicion. But how do family members live with someone who is depressed and have a continuously high index of suspicion, given the amount of distress and anxiety that might cause just in a family system on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it cannot be easy. I mean, as we'll always say, we must have a high index of suspicion. And again, there is no one single indicator for suicide potential. And those are the type of problems we work with in mental health and psychiatry, that we don't have a marker. If your blood glucose is 22, I think we can conclude you've got diabetes. But there's nothing like that for most psychiatric illnesses. But what you have to do is, that's why patients are always saying, we talk too much, you sit with you too much, you talk to us too much, just let us pass. But the thing is, we only work on that. We extrapolate and put things together. No one single sign or symptom will make a diagnosis or will increase the risk. It is a multiplicity of factors. And that's what we have to look at. And the factors will be individual, what you're presenting with, your family history, your surroundings, your psychosocial status and standing at the time. And we try and put it all together and then we sort of say, yeah, this is high risk or this is reasonable risk. And because there is no marker, because there is no percentage of how much, you can never say, oh, it was 20%, so we don't expect it. No, it's 80% we expect it. We are unable to say that. But as the risk factors increase, as that cluster of factors, and also, I mean, as you say, that is I suppose those are the tricks in psychiatry, because it's not just about you also, it's also about your environment. If you have pneumonia and you come in and you get a drip of an antibiotic, you're going to get well, whether you like it or not, you're going to get well. But if you have a depression, and even if we pump you full of medication, but the environment is terrible, there are all those social determinants of health that are not working, accommodations, money, transport, work, not to include COVID, which has changed the game for everybody. If all those are not okay, the chances that you won't get well. And I mean, that is the problem with mental illness, that it's not just about, you and what happens, it's also your environment, your family, your support systems, and many other things that you yourself and mostly your medical team cannot change, and so it makes it a whole lot more difficult. So yeah, it's hard like that. So to say, how do we then balance out the risk? It's the factors. We put the factors together and we say, this is high risk or it's higher risk, And again, unfortunately for all of us, many times there are expressions that we use in normal everyday language where we include death or suicide or die or, oh gosh, I could die, and maybe 90% of people who say that don't mean anything to do with suicide. But again, because we have to be aware, we have to be, shall I say, more alert to these type of things. You are supposed to be picking up those type of little things. And it could be a little thing, little thing. People part and they say, see you tomorrow. Says, no, I won't see you. Under normal circumstances, there's nothing to read into that. But somebody who maybe has already got a planned suicide has actually given you the whole story. No, I won't see you tomorrow. But again, you're going to miss it because you are not looking out for it. You shouldn't be looking out for it. And yes, families are going to miss a lot because no family expects their loved one to die or wants them to die. So they're not going to be able to judge things and look at things in that way. Of course, in retrospect, it might be different. But in real life, it's not always so easy. So yes, you miss those things. You don't hear them and you are not able to say, yes, they had a whole lot of risk factors. It will be, they possibly didn't have. I mean, he was happy, he was bubbling around, and he said he wants to sleep for a long time. There, he dropped the hint, but it was not obvious. In fact, everything is, and again, you remember that you're looking from your perspective as a friend, as a family member, as whoever. And your perspective is that everything's going great guns with this person. But because, of course, you don't know everything about this person. And disclosure, people disclosing their very deepest and rawest and ugliest sadness or anguish, it's not a common thing, for all sorts of reasons. I don't want to distress people. I shouldn't be feeling like this. Stigma and discrimination, all these things that we already know. So it is not an easy area. Thank you.
A great job of kind of complexifying it, which I think is so important, because I think often in this area, we want easy answers and we want to grasp quick solutions, because especially those of us who are in the space, we want to develop policies or interventions or those kinds of things. But it actually is so multifaceted. And I think the point about the social determinants of health, especially in the South African context, are so important. Because, I mean, this dialogue is called an intersectional dialogue. And I think we often forget how Department of Housing has a role to play in mental health. The Department of Education has a role to play in mental health. The Department of Safety and Security and Policing, and that if society was able to get its act together, as a country, we would improve mental health, and by implication reduce depression, reduce suicide, and all these things. Saya, can I bring you in? I know you joined us late and you never had a chance to introduce yourself. So if you don't mind just saying a little bit about who you are. And I mean, your bio was on the PsySSA website. And a few things that caught my eye was that you mentioned that you are a journalist, but you're also a survivor of suicidal ideation. And the term that you used was experimentation. And I was curious to hear a bit more about what you meant by suicidal experimentation. But also you are a social justice advocate, if I can put it that way. And perhaps linking to some of the points that was raised by Cassey and Sebo and Glynis around the relationship between suicide prevention and social justice, because I think there is an interesting relationship there that is not unpacked very well. But also just to kind of hear from your personal perspective, how you've made sense of suicide and suicide prevention.
Thank you so much, Suntosh. So again, my apologies for the late connection, and at any time if the connection seems a bit bad, please allow me to turn my screen, my video off, just because the internet on my side is a little bit dodgy. So I am a journalist. And in terms of my own mental health history, I talk about being a survivor of suicide, and not just the ideation, but the experimentation, where there have been 3 occasions in my lifetime where I have tried, in varying degrees. I think, well, in my opinion, the second attempt was the closest I ever got to succeeding at it. And the reasons for my attempts, my mental health and that, I just need to say, I want to touch back on what Glynis was saying. I want to touch back on what Dr. Siepe was saying about the warning signs and the warning symptoms. When COVID broke, when COVID hit us, within weeks, you were able to rattle off the symptoms of COVID. Everyone knew what those initial symptoms were. You could stand at a water cooler and say, oh yeah, so-and-so had this. And then when the vaccines came out, the symptoms of the reactions to the vaccines, we knew these immediately off the cuff. COVID is very new. Mental health, suicide, people choosing to take their own lives is not. So while there are signs and symptoms that can help in preventing suicide, successful suicide, sometimes there are not. And Doctor mentioned the idea that sometimes it's the person that was the bubbliest kind of thing. And before my second attempt, I was that bubbly person in the office. I was kind of the class clown, yes, we're covering very serious things in the newsroom, and I talk about social justice because when we see, just as a small example, the people who are forced to make use of SADAG's brilliant, free, affordable, or accessible healthcare versus the people who can afford private healthcare that's a lot more intimate and long-lasting, shall I say. Just that gap alone, the fact that someone can't afford to pay someone enough to help keep them alive is ghastly. For myself, I think I was about 19 years old, and I want to talk about the signs and symptoms again. I was 19 years old. If you speak to those at Suntosh University and UCT, they started a program a couple of years ago where they recognized that symptoms of mental health start really showing themselves in this 18, 19, 20-year-old spectrum, your first years kind of thing. But they also had this idea that perhaps it's only at that stage that we start learning the language of how to express those feelings and say, this is suicidal ideation. This is my experimentation. For myself, I was about 19 years old. We were moving house, and I found a drawing that I had done when I was barely able to write a sentence. You could see there was scribbled handwriting, but I knew this was mine. And I'd obviously drawn a little cartoon of myself, a little image, and said about how mommy had shouted at me or something, like I've got into a fight with one of my parents. And I spoke about how I don't want to wake up tomorrow. And I thought to myself at 19, I thought, oof, that's a little bit dark for a child. And at 24 years old was the harder attempt, the second attempt. And that was when I got diagnosed. It was at that point where I realized that I had no control over my mind at all. And I really felt like a slave to my own feelings of wanting everything to end. Got diagnosed. I'm now 29 years old. And I thought to myself the other day, jeepers, every day I take 5 different types of medication at night. And all they do is signal to my brain to not do things that are going to end up in my demise, whether that is something to calm the anxiety, something to help me sleep, something to alert my brain a little bit more in the morning, something to stave off the depression. I know when I started my antidepressant medication, whether you're changing to different types, whether you're increasing a dose, decreasing a dose, the craziest warning sign about when you change that type of medication, they always say, will increase suicidal ideation, which is just, I mean, it's a crazy thought to think that this medicine that's supposed to keep you from wanting to end your own life in the way that you deal with it can at stages make that desire or that urge a lot more. And Glynis, I've read some of your writings about your son Spencer. Another personal story from my side, when I was 16 years old, a friend of mine who was just about to turn 17, in Cape Town, he took his own life. His name was Brandon. And I can tell you that his parents especially, I mean, his friends, we sat at break, and I at one point remember seeing the signs that I would now as an adult recognize, like, these are red flags. But at the time it was, oh, Brandon, why the long face at break, blah, 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 blah. Why so tired? Why so this? And he, in his personal life, he had gone to see the professionals. He had gotten onto the medication. He was, his parents were doing all the right things. And Glynis, if I could say this message to you, I can't tell you that your book and your writings on what your son did and that experience, I can't tell you that will help save anyone or prevent anyone's suicide. I can't guarantee that. But what I can guarantee is that for parents or loved ones of those who have lost their life to suicide, you have no idea how healing reading those words will be, because Brandon's parents sat for the rest. I mean, it was, they'd wonder small things like, was it in the way that he stirred his cornflakes that morning? Was it in the way that he didn't lay his clothes out as he usually does? Was it in the way that he put his school bag at the front of the door instead of at the back of the door? These tiny, minute details that in my mind, I'm sure they are still going through right now, trying to see, was there something in the build up to that, on the day, within those hours before? And when I got the phone call, I was actually at a little school sleepover, and I got the phone call from a friend of mine's mother to say that this had happened. And I just immediately, all of these things, all of the conversations we'd had, every single word that I could recall in my conversations with him just came flooding back, and me trying to go, what could I have done? And I think it's so important for people who have loved ones who are experiencing suicide, that, and as someone who has tried to do this thing, there comes a point at which the thing that you thought would keep you alive, the thought of breaking my mom's heart and all of these things, there comes a point at which you are physically and psychologically not in control of your mind. That sense of autonomy is gone. And at that point, no one can save you from suicide apart from locking you up, putting you in a straight jacket and putting you behind bars somewhere. And we know that at the moment, just our government mental health facilities are not great, never mind the private ones. And it's something we talk about, like, oh, we should have seen signs and symptoms. And I agree that there should be more discussion, but ultimately, when we talk about autonomy also includes wanting to take your own life. And in some countries, that autonomy to do that is a human right. It has to go through a lot of checks and balances before you are granted that right, but it is also part of your autonomy. And at the end of the day, even the professionals, yes, there may be malpractice here and there, but even they themselves, unless you are chained to someone for 24 hours, 7 days a week, and there's the straitjacket kind of thing, there is no way that you can stop someone from doing this. Not an ultimate. There's no hard fix, hard solution. Again, to go back to Glynis, you spoke about that day when the police arrived. And that's an interesting one for me, because when police arrive on our doorstep, we often think, oh, there's crime, something bad has happened. There was a criminal, there was a bad guy. The good guys are here to rescue us now because there was a bad guy. And it's for this reason that I have a problem with how we in the media talk about suicide. The term commit, to say that you commit suicide implies that you are a criminal and your poor mental health is essentially criminalized. I don't know what the law or the legal framework would say about me surviving my suicidal attempts. Does that make me a reformed criminal? I don't know where that leaves us with the language. But again, if we don't even have the language to express what feeling suicidal means, what having that ideation means, what seeing those signs mean, then, before we even get there, we must just look at how we talk about it when someone has done this thing to themselves and committed this crime, so to speak. Because if we criminalize the people who have either done so successfully or have survived it, you just put a whole big gap in terms of their healing and getting over that. It's the hurdle is much higher. Another thing I need to speak about in terms of the social justice context, depression, to my understanding, and suicidal ideation, yes, it can be something that existed there before. And in my first attempt, when I looked at my life and my surroundings, everything was going well. I'd gotten a great new job. I had just graduated. Everything on paper was going right. But inside, something was wrong. The most recent attempt, which I'll admit was last year, was motivated by a sexual abuse case, a sexual harassment case that I underwent. Lawyers, attorneys, all of these things. And so in that case, there was a trigger, there was an actual trigger. When we look at social justice on the spectrum, for someone not making that 50 Rand that you were banking on making at the end of the day could be the trigger. Whereas someone in a different social setting might go, what, you tried to kill yourself over not having 50 Rand? What does that mean? And we try to, once someone has tried something like this, or they've been diagnosed with depression, we go like, oh, what's wrong? What's wrong with your life? What are you trying to fix? And if you can't show them something concrete, like this is what I'm trying to fix, maybe it's dismissed. And in other classist areas, it's hard to explain to someone that, if I live in parts of Manenberg, maybe my depression is as a result of never knowing a sense of safety in my own home my entire life. Maybe it's generational trauma. And again, I go back to how we don't talk about these things enough. But yeah, to really touch on what Glynis was saying, I to the parents and the loved ones of those who have made a successful attempt, the questions that they ask themselves, and a friend of mine says very dearly, healing is not linear. It doesn't just happen like this and, kind of, okay, things get better. it does this. Reading words like yours about Spencer and about what you and Chris endured in that time, that is a big part of the journey. And writing about mental health is a big part of the journey. Reading about suicide, with the two latest incidents, Mr. Patrick Shire and Mr. Ricky Rick, again, I look at some of the articles and just the word commit. If I see the word commit in there, I think, all right, you need to take a step back, because we're now again criminalizing the victim. The emphasis in my mind as a journalist and as a survivor and as someone who wishes that I had that language and that knowledge years and years and years ago. I think the more access to education that we can afford, the more access to information and knowledge, and not just for your middle to upper class society, mental health education, as basic as washing your hands for COVID, that, your government schools in poor areas, they were very quick to tell you to remember to wash your hands so you don't get COVID. But maybe we should have the same awareness about mental health. Maybe that kind of messaging, as vigorously as we did with COVID, needs to happen to something, or needs to be addressed to something that we've struggled with for eons longer than this one virus in particular.
Saya, thanks so much for sharing. I mean, I think just judging from the comments in the chat, and I think just, based on my own feelings as I'm listening to you speak, I really, really wish we had more time. When I initially saw 6 to 7:30, I thought, geez, that's a bit long to talk about suicide. But now I'm actually wishing we went up to 8 o'clock this evening, because I promised our attendees that we'd have enough time for questions and answers. But this has been such a rich kind of contribution, and there's so much I want to ask you, but I'm also quite wary that we've only got 7 minutes left. So I want to just loop back to Cassie, actually, because on that point about how suicide is spoken about in the media, I know that SADAG has a program coming up around responsible reporting. Cassie, do you mind just kind of speaking about that a little bit, and maybe just sharing 1 or 2 kind of insights before we just open up for a few questions from the audience?
Absolutely, and thank you. The conversation has been so critical and so important. You're absolutely right, Suntosh. We could spend hours, and I'm excited because it started a dialogue, and I really hope that this continues. I think with regards to language, and Saya brought it up, such an important thing is that we're not teaching our young children, our teenagers, how to talk about it. We assume they're going to say words like depression or suicide or want to kill myself, but they're using different words that we're missing. And even as society, committed suicide, we still see it. We saw it now recently with Ricky Rick. There's a lot of the do's and don'ts about responsible reporting for suicide. It can be, the press and media can be such an important platform to help us to create awareness, to have a call to action, to help link people who are feeling that way to care and support and help. I think the biggest concern is when we're seeing things like committed suicide, or we're seeing suicide notes being printed and sensationalizing suicide. And this leads to bigger issues like suicide contagion. SADAG works very closely, as Glynis knows, with journalists about mental health reporting and responsible reporting around suicide, especially because it's such a sensitive issue. We're actually hosting a workshop in April on responsible reporting guidelines for suicide. We will share all the details afterwards. And we really encourage as many people to be part of that conversation. And so I'm definitely reaching out to you as a speaker, because I think we need more voices, more people who are talking from lived experience to people that are in that space, to understand why. Don't just use the words committed suicide, that this is what it means and this is the impact. So we'll definitely share those details.
Thanks, Cassie. I'm going to ask our panelists that if they want to respond to questions in the chat, they can do that. But what I will do in the meantime is maybe just go back to each panelist and ask them for a couple of closing comments so that we can end on time. So Glynis, I know that many of the panelists today kind of spoke to you quite directly, and it seemed to have been quite a good kind of conversation amongst each other. And I'm just wondering whether you have any kind of closing comments or reflections to make, and just to thank you again for sharing so openly.
No, I really appreciated those comments to get that kind of feedback. And I just think we need more of these kind of conversations. And certainly that point about committing suicide that was made just now, we all need to make a point of making it died by suicide. But there are other conversations about this too, including the euthanasia conversation, which is great for another day. But yeah, thank you very much for opening this conversation to these kind of questions. And thank you to those who gave answers.
Thank you, Glynis. Yeah, I see Leonie Foster's suggestion in the chat that we should have a follow-up session just of Q&A. And I really like that, because I'm often very critical of webinars or events that have no time for questions and answers. And now I have been guilty of that as a facilitator as well. But we just had such good contributions from our panelists. Sebo, can I come back to you? And are there any kind of closing remarks that you have? And in particular, I would like to hear your thoughts on where South Africa should be heading in terms of, at the bare minimum, developing some sort of national suicide strategy. And I know this is a point that Cassie had raised when we had chatted on email before this webinar. Do you think as a country we're kind of moving closer to having a more kind of coherent plan around how we do suicide prevention? So that's just one question to you, but also some closing comments from you.
Thank you, Suntosh. In terms of I put everything together, closing and suicide plan, or suicide prevention plan, sorry, that was not right. I really think we would have made great strides if mental health was better understood. And I think it was Saya who said, you know, I mean, simple things. COVID is 2 years old. Mental health is as long as we've all been alive and longer. Simple thing like wash your hands. We should be looking, engaging with mental health issues in that fashion. You know, simple messages to the community that actually everybody buys in. By everybody, I mean that there is a president who stands at 8 o'clock and say, fellow South Africans, something, watch out for this. You know, it would go a long way, and it's not an expensive intervention. It is not costly. It doesn't require too much. He'll need a script from, somebody, but from early on, school time, school going age, when children, this should be part of, I don't know if LO starts at that level, but it should be sort of like LO at that level, where kids and bigger kids, and then parents, and everybody knows you're looking out for somebody's mood, how they're sleeping, how they're eating, how they're interacting. Are they able to use their heads in terms of memory, concentration, attention, focus, those type of things, simple things that every person can understand, and yet they are so important in terms of mental health. So I think if we have a better grasp of mental health and a better understanding throughout our communities, and people take mental health as a serious, or mental health illnesses as serious illnesses that actually need attention, as opposed to needing to be berated and stigmatized and laughed about and make jokes. I think there are more jokes about mental health conditions than anything else, which is really unfortunate. It's seriously unfortunate. That once we are at that step, it is easier to develop suicide-specific type of interventions, I think, because now we're already aware that this is a reality and this is associated with mental health. If we're aware of mental health, then we'll be aware of suicide. It will be easier to understand suicide. And I mean, there's a lot of other training apart from in terms of professionals, and sad to say in the medical profession, where I think somebody did make a mention in the chat, I'm not sure, that also the attitude of mental health practitioners at different levels when somebody has tried to take their own life. Is not always one that is caring, that is understanding, that is willing to help. In fact, if anything, many a times you find that people are ridiculed and insulted and treated in the most abominable way. And those type of things that make it more difficult for people to disclose, and there should be clearer support for people who need who need support, and we should, I don't know, I'm saying we, and I don't know, we is a wide we, but in terms of integrating mental health at primary care level, at the government level. It's most primary care looking at flu and diabetes and high blood pressure and things, and very little mental health. Yes, mental health is a specialized area, but it is important to look at it from that point of view, because if you're looking at it only at hospice central, in a hospital central way, you're only catching very few people, whereas the majority of people with mental health issues are at primary healthcare level.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sebo, and thank you for all the amazing work that you've done.
Thank you.
And thank you, Cassie. Thank you, Glynis. Thank you, Sebo. Thank you, Saya. Thank you, Mohammed in the background, who's been helping with some of the tech. And thank you, Fatima, for organizing. And just thank you to everyone who's participated in this dialogue. My gratitude, but also my apologies to everyone that we did not have a chance to actually hear the voices of some of our attendees. But I can see that there's high demand for a follow-up Q&A session, just judging from the comments. So Fatima, I think we might have to put some pressure on the PsySSA office to organize a follow-up very shortly, even if it's just with the same group of people, and somehow or the other get this amazing group of people to put aside, even if it's just an hour, to come back and reconvene. Because one of the questions I wanted to end with, and I'm going to just throw this question out to everyone, and I'm not going to make time for any answers because there might be stomachs that are grumbling. I'm speaking for myself at least. But how do we move from awareness to action? And how do we make sure that this was not just another webinar that we attended? How do we ensure that as a collective, and every one of you that, I'm seeing 122 people, which is a really great turnout. How do we make sure that the 122 people that attended this webinar, and how do we make sure the panelists that are here and the PsySSA office and SASOP and SADAG and journalists and writers and activists and survivors of suicide, how do we all come together in a way that's meaningful, that's collaborative, that actually kind of moves the needle a little bit forward? So that if we're sitting here 1 year later and having the same conversation, it doesn't seem like we are lamenting the same issues in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time. And so for me, that's really important that we find a balance between having these conversations, which are really important, but also balancing them with some sort of pragmatism around suicide prevention, because ultimately it is about, as we heard today, real people, real lives, real families, real communities. So, on that note, I'm going to close the discussion, and I'm going to thank everybody for making the time, and do have that there is help always available. Please be aware of that for yourself, but also for the people who are in your lives. And we will hopefully, crossing fingers, host a Q&A session very soon. And I know for sure, and I can say that with certainty, that the recording will be available afterwards. So if you would like to revisit this conversation, or you would like to share the recording with people who could not make it today, please do that as well. I'm sure the PsySSA office will very efficiently release that recording. Fatima says it'll be available next week. Thank you so much, Fatima. Fatima, I'm not sure if there's any closing remarks from the PsySSA office, or whether we can all gently leave and go on. Saya, I see your hands up, so I'm going to kind of give you the last word if you want.
Not really a last word. I think this is until next time. Just my closing remark, that I saw there was a question in the Q&A about how do we convince people to take their medication. When we talk about mental health, restoring a sense of person's sense of autonomy is so important. When I felt like I was losing my mind, it was that helped me help myself. It was psychiatrists, it was psychologists, members of this fraternity that helped me to empower myself. You'll see that the SADAG links are all posted there, the contacts are there. Whether you are someone struggling with this thing or struggling to help a loved one, contact the professionals and ask them how they think we can best empower other people to address this. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely evening further.